Latch the windows, lock the doors, and put the kids to bed. It's time for another episode of
Tales from the Garage!
Hey guys, I'm back again. With 5 minutes ago, I wasn't thinking of doing a video, so I really haven't done any preparation for this. I'm trying to get myself a normal schedule because I really seriously have to look for a job, so I'm trying to sleep nights, but it's just not working. And typically, when I started doing the Tales from the Garage, I was doing them very late at night. And to me, they're best suited for late at night. And I just get into the vibe more. Recently, though, the ones that I have filmed were done not quite so late at night, 10 p.m. or so. But today I'm coming to you, I'm back in the late night mode again. Until 5 or 10 minutes ago, I was laying in bed trying to get to sleep. And realized I'm just too wide awake. It's after midnight, so it really is, me getting back to, not necessarily the days doing it at 2 or 3 in the morning, but who knows, by the time I finish filming the video, and I gather up all my stuff to go back into the main part of the condo, it may be that time, I don't know. So I thought, well, it's been a couple days now since I did a video, and I am wide awake, and I could sit there and go through my millions of emails, but I did that for a couple hours before I went to bed to try to go to sleep, and a little fried from watching TV or whatever, so decided to come out here in late night mode and do some more vinyl pulls. So I'm just going to start pulling some vinyl and see what happens. What the hell is this? Oh, okay. I don't know if I type. Keith Jarrett, Treasure Island. I guess I could. It's got half the shrink wrap on it, so I guess I could finally pull off the rest of the shrink. This is something that I played it. Now I only have this on album. I don't have this on CD. And this goes back to the era of I had naturally discovered Keith Jarrett on ECM Records and had a ton of stuff on ECM Records, but decided after, and this is still the LP era. This is before CDs came around. So this would have been the probably very early 80s, maybe late 70s. I had already had a bunch of stuff on ECM on vinyl, so I decided to go outside his ECM to see what his other the music that he recorded for other record labels offered. And this was I guess this was originally Impulse, MCA Impulse. I guess this was a later edition. You could see this weird kind of gold stamp on there. That they just stamped it over the name Treasure Island. I know MCA and Impulse were two separate companies, and one bought the other, and they started rebranding their stuff. So I guess this vinyl pressing came out at a period that they hadn't had time to change the cover art yet, maybe, or put the company logo on. So they started putting this gold stamp on a lot of the albums as they came off the production line. And now I was familiar with the musician on here. This is his Keith's American, essentially quartet, but quartet with additional musicians, which is weird because Keith did do a little bit of recording on ECM with the American quartet, strictly as a quartet. But this was kind of a weird period for him because I think he was recording for both ECM and this other label simultaneously. So somehow he had contracts with two record companies. And it's weird that a record company would allow him to go off and work with another one. So this is recorded in 2 days in February of 1974. And Keith most certainly has. You know, I have to do this stuff from memory because I don't know what I'm going to pick. But I know Keith definitely has things on ECM from the same time period. So somehow he was allowed to record for multiple labels simultaneously. And this is the American Quartet, which, like I said, also recorded for ECM strictly as a quartet. And yet when Keith would do other recordings with the same musicians in the quartet on other labels, he always seemed to add musicians to it, like generally percussionists. He would have one or two percussionists augmenting the quartet, which made it interesting, if not really necessary. So here we have the American Quartet with Dewey Redman on tenor saxophone and tambourine, Paul Motion on drums, and where's the bass player? Charlie Hayden on bass. I thought it would be Charlie Hayden, but I couldn't find his name on here. Now also on this album, he's got Guillermo Franco and Danny Johnson on percussion. I'm not sure whether or not those were the same two percussionists that would appear on other albums that he recorded at this period. At least one of them were. And also on this he has Sam Brown on guitar. Now Sam Brown usually played electric guitar, even with Keith. So that was an interesting balance to the sound. A couple things. Now I want to say, for some reason I pulled this out and was talking about this on a video. Not that, going back a ways. It wasn't a vinyl pull because I wouldn't have put it back on the shelf there. But I recall being slightly disappointed in the sound, number one. The studios that these were recorded at, which I think was in New York, Generation Sound Studios, New York City, not as well recorded as the ECM stuff. So that was always, to me, a bit of a problem with the non-ECM albums by Keith Jarrett. And the bigger the band, the bigger the problem. When you've got two percussionists and a guitar in addition to the quartet, it's kind of a lot of sound going on. Especially percussionists can tend to be noisy and maybe just too much going on at any given time. And if you don't have a really high quality recording with the good separation of sound between the instruments, it can really sound a bit messy. And with the two percussionists kind of rattling away, and these are just my perceptions, it tends to get in the way. The quality of the recording isn't quite there. So, but like I said, I had pulled this out earlier, and I thought I was talking about this at some other point, just months ago, because it did make me go. I don't have this on CD. It did make me go on YouTube though and play it on YouTube. And the sound on YouTube was much better from the posting of this album up there. It was much better than I recalled from the vinyl. It could be the pressing, whatever. But again, it's been decades since I listened. It's probably been 20 years since I listened to this, actually from this particular album. And so the recorded sound on listening to the album on YouTube was much better than I remembered. And I actually enjoyed it quite a bit more than I thought I would. At some point, I would probably consider picking this up on CD. As far as the material, it doesn't really stand. I really don't have much of a recollection of it. It's all originals by Keith Jarrett. And like I said, you've got the band is there in terms of musicianship with Charlie Hayden, Dewey Redman, who both passed away now, Paul Motion, who's also passed away. Guillermo Franco and Danny Johnson, I don't really know much about. Also, guitarist Sam Brown has also passed away. So, a lot of musicians you won't hear from again. The cover of this isn't great. The back cover is actually better. I like these map. I should have stuck this as the front cover, I think. So, having pulled this out now, though, this is an album I'm curious to actually hear again. So I'll probably hit the YouTube thing and look for it and give it a listen. I know I did look a few months ago to see if this was in print on CD, and there's a couple different versions of it where you can get the album. I think you can get it in a tube fur package with two CDs from this era, both from this label of Keith Jarrett. And I know there's a bigger, more expensive box set from his non-ECM work that includes a number of albums, 5 or 6 albums. This may be one of those, but I'm not sure. He did a bit of, on the American side, he did a bit of label jumping and changing. So, you know, some things as far as being available again on CD are dependent on the original label that they're from. But I know this is on CD, and I was surprised because I didn't have an overall good impression of it necessarily. But after hearing it on YouTube, I was much more impressed. So I'm probably going to go listen to it again. I happen to really like this band. One of the albums they recorded for ECM, which would have been, I guess, roughly around this period, mid to late 70s, is called the Survivor Suite, which I believe is just strictly the quartet. And Survivor Suite is one of my favorite Keith Jarrett albums. Certainly one of my favorite band albums, group albums by him, because I really tend to prefer solo albums by him where he's just the only musician, or those compositional albums where he writes for like orchestras and stuff like that. But Survivor Suite is easily, with pretty much the same quartet, is one of my favorite, if not my favorite, actual group albums by Keith Jarrett. That one being on ECM, naturally. Okay, let me go pick another one. Yeah. No, I want to say I pulled, I want to say I pulled this, and now I did restock my shelf here. Well, let me tell you what it is. It's an ECM album, no big surprise. John Abercrombie's Arcades. And I want to say I talked about this recently, but maybe I didn't. And now what happened is recently I restocked my shelf. I brought a bunch of LPs out here that were on my bedroom floor. And it could be, now that I think about it, it's possible that I took some vinyl pulls from an earlier edition and I did bring them in there. So maybe I am repeating myself here. I'm not sure. But I'm here and I'm recording, so I'm going to talk about it anyway. What did I say about this? This was one of my earlier purchases, not my earliest, but very early on my John Abercrombie adventure. I first heard John doing a guest solo spot on Bar Phillips' Mountainscapes album. That was the first place where I heard him. Made me think, I just like the solo so much in there that I said I got to find something by this guitarist. And I know I bought the Gateway 2 album with John, which was John Abercrombie, Jack DeJohnette, and Dave Holland. And I bought Characters, my favorite John Abercrombie album, right in that same time period. Characters is his solo album. And I want to say this may be the one that I bought after that. I didn't know it at the time. For me, this is John's prime period, is all of those first 3 albums that I picked up of his as a leader, actually the first 4 albums, were all the things that I consider like the top things he's ever done. I don't really think it's just a case of, I happen to like them because these are the first things I picked up. I just think at this point in the late 70s, John was in his mode. He had kind of shrugged off the last vestiges of the fusion era that he came up in, that he got known for even before he was recording as a leader. He was recording with Billy Cobham and a number of other people as a sideman. Brecker Brothers too, I think. And more in a fusion mode. And even when he started on his own and he recorded the Timeless album, which I picked last time, he was still a bit in that mode. But after that, he kind of dropped the fusion thing, and he found a sound on the electric guitar and his electric mandolin, which were just really his, like, you know it's him when you hear him play. And and I think was a heavy influence on the original sound of Pat Metheny. If you listen to like the early Pat Metheny albums, like Watercolors and the first Pat Metheny group album, that softer, clean guitar sound, I have to think was influenced by John Abercrombie. So this was maybe my third John Abercrombie album, and it was the first of 3 albums he recorded with this trio. And this was really his first working band. Prior to that, his other albums were him gathering up musicians to record the session, but they weren't working bands. So he had this band together for a few years, and consisted of Richie Bayrock on piano, and George Mraz on bass, and a guy named Peter Donald on drums. I know Peter Donald actually retired from the music industry and became a teacher, and not a music teacher, oddly enough. I just read that recently because I was wondering what happened to him. I didn't hear much of him after about 1980 or so. Richie Bayrock and George Mraz still going many sessions later. But as far as those 3 musicians in the band, this is the first time I heard any of them. I like Richie Bayrock's really rich, probably Debussy-inspired piano playing. He's, I guess you could say, close to a mainstream jazz player, but a bit more romantic, a bit more lyrical maybe. Definitely there's a classical influence in there. And I've got other things which Richie did as a leader as well. But this really turned me on to him. And this was the first album that John recorded with this band. I think it was 1980. It's 1978. It's really hard to read this though here. Yeah, it looks like it was recorded in December 1978. The first of 3 albums with this group. And like I mentioned when I pulled out another album by John, the 3 albums with this group, which came one right after the other in 3 following years, 78, 79, and 80 they were recorded in. I can't pick a favorite. Like all 3 of them are so good that my favorite of them is like constantly revolving, which goes to show you there's not a weak one out of those 3 that would stand out, that would say, well, that one didn't work. These took forever to come out on CD, and when they did come out a couple years ago in they came out all together as a 3 CD box set on ECM, which makes sense. It's all the same musicians. All 3 albums kept the band the same, and there's a continuity there. Now in this band, Richie Bayrock, the pianist, does as much writing as John Abercrombie does. So it's really almost like a co-led group. The thing is they're of such a like mind though, that when I listen to the albums, I can never remember which track was written by which guy. So they're not so distinctly different in terms of a musical direction that you can point out, oh, that's a John Abercrombie track, or that's a Richie Bayrock track. They really work well together, even though composed apart from one another. There's only one track of the 3 albums they recorded together that wasn't written by either John Abercrombie or Richie Bayrock, and that's George Mraz did write one of the tracks on the 3rd and final album by the quartet, which turned out to be a good track. It kind of made me wish that George Mraz had contributed more. But there's all originals. There was no covers, no versions of standards on this. And at this time, John had this is just about the mellowest guitar sound he ever had at this period. This period that included characters and the quartet work. Very, very soft, very smooth guitar sound, not like a smooth jazz sound. Like a mainstream jazz sound, but a little more updated. And the big part of his playing, now he was also playing acoustic guitar a bit on the albums at this point, but I'm not sure, but I generally don't get credited, so I'm fairly sure that on one of these the 3 quartet albums that he recorded, that there is some acoustic guitar on there somewhere, and they didn't credit it on the album. Now, this album, again, they're only crediting electric guitar and electric mandolin. This is the album that really, for me, made me realize how big a part the sound of the electric mandolin was for years in John Abercrombie's music. It's evident on the Gateway 2 album, where there's almost as much electric mandolin as there is guitar. It's very evident on the all solo, just John Abercrombie by himself, the Characters album, which has a lot of electric mandolin on there. The album even starts off with like a 4 or 5 minute electric mandolin solo before the other guitars come in. And it was like the MO that John had at the time, that he layered guitars and would often have the main melody of whatever piece he was playing was actually stated on the mandolin, often doubled with the electric guitar. But the mandolin was the most prominent melody instrument in a lot of his works at this time. The main melody was almost most loudly kind of mixed and stated by the electric mandolin. And it really was just such a unique sound. And I'm sorry when he stopped using it in his music, because it was it's an instrument with a very limited range. And when I first heard it, I did think that it was just John playing on the upper end of the guitar, without the bass strings or without the lower end of the guitar. I thought it was John simply playing very high up on the fretboard, on like the thinner 3 or 4 strings in the guitar. But it turned out to be electric mandolin. But it's, I really came to love the sound. When I want to hear John Abercrombie play, this is pretty much the stuff I go to, because I love that mandolin sound he had. And he had the guitars playing, a great deal as well, doubled on the guitars, and the guitarist maybe playing a rhythm part or picking out chords or whatever. But the electric mandolin kind of soaring over everything he did at the time was just something that, I don't know, nobody did. Nobody did. This was all his at this point, and continued until the early 80s, really. But this is the prime period. This, out of the 3 albums he recorded with the quartet, I want to say very often this falls as being my favorite. It is probably actually the hardest to get into of the 3. Oddly enough, not because it's the most avant-garde, but because it's the most mellow. It's a very short album. It's not even quite 40 minutes, I remember. But it's, I wouldn't say abstract, but it's a bit like classical music. Like, you really have to listen. It's very subtle. It's the most subtle and quietest of the 3 albums that this quartet recorded, and often falls as being my favorite. But a lot of people will hear that as being just mellow, because there's no tracks on here where they really kind of like rip out and just start jamming and drum solos and just really up-tempo stuff. There's no real up-tempo stuff on here. This is very, very impressionistic, and one of the most, by far, impressionistic albums that John ever did. And certainly definitely falls into one of the most mellow of the albums he did as well. But it's just beautiful. You've got Richie Beirach's, I want to say Debussy-inspired semi-classical jazz piano going, and very lyrical and very nice, and but with the sophisticated chord sequences that you hear in jazz music, and you've got. But it stays in that kind of lower atmospheric groove. This was probably not something necessarily meant to be a late night album, but it turns out it is a great late night album. Of the 3 the quartet recorded, it's the most late night album because of this beautiful impressionism that goes on, and just the fact that they don't really step it up. The other 2 albums have more up-tempo tracks on them, and more times when the band is obviously getting, I'd say aggressive, because none of the stuff they did was really that aggressive, but certainly much more up-tempo than this. And, you know, just talking about it again makes me want to, I'm going to end up playing this when I get done here. Great album, great album. If you can get it, I highly recommend it. And I'm talking too much. I don't know if I want to go to that end, because I know that's all my Klaus Schulze stuff there. I think I'm going to avoid that. Well, I didn't mean to pick this out, but I got it. Guess what? I picked out an ECM album. We got 2 for 1, another Keith Jarrett album. It's funny, when I was talking about Keith Jarrett, I was thinking about this album. I picked out a lot of Keith Jarrett in the last couple of videos. You know, when I was talking about Spirits, I thought about this album. It's a duet album. This is one of the first things that Keith recorded for ECM, as a matter of fact. Keith Jarrett and Jack DeJohnette. And I wouldn't say it's one of the best, but it's for a fan like me of both of these musicians. It's a very early, very interesting to hear album. Now, this was recorded in, I believe, a single session in, well, where's the date on here? Oddly enough, not at ECM Studios, but recorded in Los Angeles. This came out in '73. Now, could this be the only ECM album I've ever seen that doesn't have a recording date on it? That's really weird. Really weird. No recording date. I know, however, that this was one of the first things that Keith did, and actually would have been Jack, I guess, as a leader as well for ECM. Came out in '73. It was recorded sometime before that. I seem to recall what I read about this. It's just a duet album, just these 2 guys. With Jack DeJohnette playing drums and percussion, Keith Jarrett playing piano, flute, and oddly enough, electric piano, though the electric piano appears very, very briefly, only on 1 track, I seem to remember, and organ. Or maybe the piano's on more than 1 track and the organ's on 1 track. Because Jarrett does play electric piano and organ, but not a lot. And the tracks are a mixture of things credited just to Keith, and more than half of them are credited to the both of them, Jack DeJohnette and Keith. What I remember about reading about this, because it was always a curious thing, and you know, for people familiar with Keith Jarrett, being an acoustic purist that he is, it's a bit weird to hear him play electric piano. But I believe this was the period that both Keith and Jack were playing with Miles Davis still. This is before Miles Davis kind of went into his semi-retirement for about 5 years. And I know Keith and Jack had played as part of his band. I didn't think they were part of his band this late, but they may have been still at this point. Because I seem to recall that these guys said that they... apparently Manfred Eicher had approached 2 of them about recording an album, and I believe they were actually touring with Miles at this time. And I remember they had a day off, and decided to go into a recording studio. Like I said, this was not recorded actually at the usual ECM studios in Oslo, but rather in Los Angeles. And I think the reason it was recorded in Los Angeles is because that's possibly where Keith and Jack were scheduled to play their next gig with Miles Davis, and or they were both there for some reason, and they decided to go into a studio and pretty much make it up as they went along. I believe there's very, very, very little preparation for this album. There's a few things that date this album horribly, and one of them I recall is when Keith does play the electric piano. I'm pretty sure he's playing it through a wah-wah pedal, and anytime you hear that, there's only a couple years in the 1971 to 1973 period that anybody pretty much did that. And it's a disgusting sound, and you know, and it pretty much ruins any music that's coming out of it. It just, wah-wah pedal was not made for a piano. So there's that going on. But that was still the influence of Miles, because Keith was not playing electric instruments before he joined Miles. Miles wanted him to play electric instruments, and so it stuck with him for a little bit before he completely went solo and ditched the electric instruments again. So there's kind of it's actually funky at times. where there's this electric piano used with the wah-wah pedal thing. And it's a very, very dated funk. I was around when this stuff was hip and modern in the early 70s. And it's a sound very much rooted in the early 70s. And I think of certain exploitation movies that use the kind of soundtrack and stuff like that. So it's certainly a mixed album. It's not one to get when you're early into getting into Keith Jarrett or Jack DeJohnette, because they've both got such large catalogs of music. But if you're a hardcore fan, it's really interesting to hear these guys very early in their, establishing of their solo careers. And there's a few tracks on here that remind me, oddly enough, of Keith Jarrett's Spirits album, which is one that I just pulled out in just the past video. And that is when there's more of an acoustic thing going on, and Jack's playing various patterns on percussion, and Keith is playing flutes. There's kind of this ethnic thing going on. And when I first got the Spirits album, which I reviewed, which was just Keith completely solo, recording stuff at his home, where he had a lot of tracks of him playing various hand percussion with flutes over it, it harkened back to this album for me. There's a few pieces on here scattered where there's this percussion flute thing going on, and it's kind of got that ethnic flavor, and it's interesting. And it was weird because the Spirits album came out 11, 12 years after this. At least 12 years after this, actually. I don't know that this was recorded in 73 or just got released in 73. It may have been recorded a little bit before that and didn't get released right away. But again, when I'm curious, this is an album that I still pull out and listen to from time to time. And again, now that I talk about it, I want to hear it again. But this is not one I would recommend, though I love the cover. It is not a typical ECM cover. And I think I know I have this on CD. I think they changed the cover for the CD, if I'm not mistaken. But I love duo albums, so I'm always kind of drawn to playing it. And my initial I was quite disappointed when I first got this, though. That electric piano with the wah-wah pedal and the dated funky stuff just doesn't make it flow like an album should flow. And then the other stuff with the acoustic piano. And just the flutes and the percussion pieces really sound nice, and they do kind of work, apart from the electric funky stuff. So it's a bit too schizophrenic as far as a complete listening experience, as far as how it flows. I hope I'm not disturbing my neighbor upstairs, because it's quite late now. Okay, I love that cover, though. Did I mention that I love the cover? Okay, I think I've pulled out 3 albums that I've spoken about already. But this is not a rerun. So, it seems to be that I can only get to 3 albums without going into a 17-hour video. So that's where we are. Okay, guys, thanks for joining me. I hope there was something of value to the selections that I pulled, and I'm gonna sit here and probably listen to some of these now, if not all 3. And I'll be up probably to dawn. Okay, guys, hope everybody's doing well, and I'll be back soon. Bye-bye.
Tune in next time for more
Tales from the Garage.